Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a quick minute to let you know that we've launched our Patreon site and that you can now become a supporter of the show. The awards in there include artist features on our website and shout outs on the show, as well as open invitations to join fellow patrons in our roundtable discussion episodes. So if you think you might be interested, please take a look at the link in the description or just go to patreon.com/@percussion. So /AT percussion. Okay, thanks for listening. He's really into it, and we all play it. And man, I can tell who's the imposter just by watching the Zoom. Like my sister gets this grin on her face. And do you know this game, Brian?
Yeah, my drum line has been, because we're doing drum line for marching band now. It's basically day Ian's class, and so they've been asking. So we've actually got Julie Davila is gonna do a guest appearance tomorrow night, which is gonna be awesome. Good. And then we're gonna play Among Us, and then another buddy of mine is it off. So, but they've been asking. They're like, we should get on Discord and we should do this. So yeah, I've played it once and I was awful at it. Like they kicked me off. They thought I was the like, no, I'm just new.
It's really fun.
Yeah,
I understand the hype a little bit. I've had some fun.
But the weird thing, dude, is that game's been around for like 2 years.
Yeah, and then
it's not new.
Right. It's caught fire.
Yep.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, there's an orchestral excerpt in the news today. Sorry.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so trigger warning for anyone who's been to grad school. So hey there everybody, it's November 15th, 2020. It's at Percussion 262. My name's Cangelosi. I'm hosting today, and I'm kind of co-hosting with Brian Nosny. What's up, Brian?
Hey guys.
And also Ben Charles.
Hey Casey.
And Karli Viña. How's it going?
Hey Casey, it's going all right. How are you?
Good, thanks. Hey, did you all go to PASIC?
Not at all.
I signed up. I did everything. I've seen 2 sessions so far. Oh wait, no, sorry, 3. I just watched our buddy Bill Shaltis. He did a fundamentals timpani thing, so it's nice you can go back and watch. And yeah, I mean, considering it's COVID, considering we couldn't meet in person, I think they did a really good job. So yeah, way to go, Bill Shaltis. That was really cool. And yeah, I mean, we had an audition day. We had a regular day of school that Friday, so I haven't been to much yet, but I plan on going back and watching, so hopefully we can chat about PASIC a little bit.
Casey, I was going to check. I think that they're online like till the end of the year, though. Like you can go and watch the archives, I think. Am I right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my plan. It was a super busy weekend for me too, but knowing like they're there, I can't wait to binge watch all the sessions that I missed and catch up on that, because it sounds like there was great stuff.
I got little invitation messages like, hey, can you come to a little Zoom hang or whatever? And I was imagining everyone, like the background is the Westin Hotel, on Zooms, like the Westin Hotel.
It was Shula's.
Or Shula's, yeah.
Someone actually made a soundtrack of the exhibit hall that you could put on, and it was just like a bunch of like badly rendered Porgy and Bess excerpts and like marching snare drums just stacked on top of each other.
And kids just going like
that was
that
Ridge.
and look at the
Isn't that the only thing we don't miss
Ridge
with
did
live
that.
PASIC?
That's right. I do not miss that at all. Hey, so we are releasing on December 17th, and a couple things in the news. It was Beethoven's baptism. This is a really nerdy news week, sorry. Baptism of Ludwig von Beethoven in 1770. And did you all know his exact birth date is not known? I didn't know that. Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's
not
interesting.
surprising.
Yeah, right, not too surprising. Zanakis' birth date, not exactly known, although it's pretty close margin. So yeah, when you look up Beethoven's birth date, in fact, the only reason we know the month and the year is because of the baptism record. So, yeah, we know the month was December, but we don't know the date. We just know that baptism was then. So, interesting. So, what else? 1957, the last episode of the Nat King Cole Show airs on NBC. So, we talked about the premiere of that show, and we talked about the racial significance and all the things that happened. Well, not all of them. We talked about a handful of things that happened around the Nat King Cole Show. That was pretty cool. So, I thought it was also interesting that also on a Thursday, a year later, Of course, different month, but Thursday was the last show. And you guys know, again, nerd alert, we have an excerpt premiere. Do you guys remember, let's see. Wait, I don't need the music. What am I doing? Do you remember this? You know that one?
Yeah.
So yeah, Shasti 10 premiered, and that's one of our fast and loud snare drum excerpts, 1953. So there's your news for the day. And now I want to introduce our guest. He got his doctorate from Indiana University. He's finishing a master's degree in kinesiology. He's performed with Alabama Symphony Orchestra, Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra, and many, many, many others. He's worked with the very known Emmy Award-winning group Blast, who I'm sure we all know a lot about. Of course, there's huge percussion enthusiasm through Blast. And he's assistant professor of trombone. Wait, that can't be right. Trombone at Troy University. Brian, what is that, some kind of joke? This is a percussion podcast. It's real funny, Brian.
This was news to me. I'm sorry.
He's assistant professor of trombone at Troy University, and his name's Jason Sulliman. How's it going, Jason?
It's going well. Thanks so much for for having me. I must have accidentally clicked the percussion on the drop-down menu, and so that might have been my mistake. But yeah, I am a trombonist. Sorry.
You're a percussionist now.
Okay, fair enough. I did take percussion techniques classes in my schooling, so that counts.
How was your buzz roll at the end of it?
I did okay. I did all right. The diddles and the rolls were okay. I was not very good at flams because that's very different for brass players. We try to line up everything really closely, like perfectly. So the concept of having it not be lined up perfectly was really a mind fuck for me.
Cool. Excellent. Well, hey, I was going to open by just saying you worked with Brian Nosny. What was the hardest part about that? What was the most difficult thing about working with Brian Nosny?
Oh,
We don't have enough time for this.
yeah. How long is your show? No, you know what? Brian was actually awesome to work with, and he, ironically, there was another individual who worked there who knew both of us and said, "Hey, if you need anything, contact this person, contact Brian." And when I got there, I had like a big moving truck and all my stuff, and I kind of needed to move everything into the office really quickly. And I'm not normally the kind of person who reaches out to complete strangers and be like, "Hey, can you help me move?" That's usually not my thing. But I was really in a pinch given the timing of everything. And sure enough, I texted Brian. I had no idea who he really was. And he was there like minutes later, helping me like move all my stuff into the office. And he got some other students to help. And it was great. I mean, we just, we kind of clicked right from there. And,
Cool.
it was really great working with him the time that we had. So I kind of missed that bromance, being so local. It's a little bit more of a long distance thing now, but.
He's I've got my own bromance with old Brian Nosny. Hey, Ksenija just showed up. Hey, Ksenija.
Hey, I'm so sorry I'm late. Hi, Jason. So nice to meet you. And I'm sorry I missed all the Casey jokes.
Hey, we talked about Shostakovich. There was Shostakovich from your home country there.
My husband, my late husband.
Stupid joke. Jason, what the heck is kinesiology? And I mean, I know it's like it's human movement, and I know it's about that. But what does that have to do with music? And how are you getting a master's degree in it? That's really, really cool.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Kinesiology is the study of human movement, and probably the easiest way to explain it to people who wonder like what the through line is with musicians or performing artists is that in order for us to play our instruments, we have to move our bodies, in some way, whether it's percussion or voice or conducting or whatever. There's movement that's involved in the body in some way. So specifically within kinesiology, there's a couple of different kind of subsections. The most common one that people think about is more on the like exercise science side or the physiology side. And though that I find that interesting and I've done some work on that side, I'm more interested in the motor learning and motor control, which is really just a fancy scientific way of saying how we learn how to move and then how we learn how to control our movements. So if you take the word motor and exchange it with movement, It's just movement learning and movement control. And so it's basically a scientific field that's dedicated toward measuring and, hypothesizing and testing how people get good at refining movements, whether it's children that are just developing or it's expertise research in athletics or performing arts. It's basically just a field of study that tries to answer the question, how do people get good at stuff? And that's pretty much the short way of kind of describing what it is. But from there, I think it's a lot easier of a sell to understand, how it can be applicable to what we do as musicians. So.
Well, and so much of what I've heard of you is it's so much about mental practice and how we practice. How is kinesiology informed? Because like I can think of like, oh yeah, hey, don't practice too hard or wrong, or you'll injure yourself. How is it really informed the whole mental side of practicing things?
Well, it's interesting because I think originally, if and I don't know how far we want to drill down on the epistemology of the discipline, but originally there were sports. And people love sports and people wanted to get good at sports. And so there was money being thrown at studies to figure out how people get better at shooting a basketball or jumping a hurdle or, running with the football or whatever. And then there was a point where the government kind of, we'll say like the 40s and 50s where World War II, was around that time. And so there was this interest in justifying the need for young people in school to be physically well and be in pretty good shape, that kind of a thing. And so in some ways it was kind of an effort to make a more ready, workforce in terms of drafting into the army. And so physical education became a subject in school, but then there was a time where people said, well, wait, do we really need that? Or how does that work? Like, what do we really need to do to get everybody in shape? And so then the field of exercise science, came out of that as a way to kind of justify and explain the how and the what and the why behind physical education. So that's kind of where, that all started. And then for a long time, it kind of stayed there. It's not that performing arts wasn't a part of it at all, but the money was clearly dominated on the sports side. And so a lot of the information kind of came from sports and fed into sports. And so when you think about sports, questions that come up where, like, let's say you're doing a football practice and somebody's trying to learn a certain drill or movement on the field, some kind of, formation and the thing, that's the extent of my football knowledge. But, do you do massed practice or blocked practice? Do you do the same thing 10 times in a row and then go to the next thing and do that 10 times in a row and then go to the next thing and do that 10 times in a row? Or is it better to do the first one, the second one, the third one, the first one, the second one, the third one? How do you block things and rotate through things? What's the best way for retention of skill? Is it better to have a batter go into a batting cage and just get fastballs? Do they get better at hitting fastballs? Or is it better if they're being thrown fastballs and curveballs and sliders?
Right.
It happens with error parameterization. So you look at all that kind of stuff. And they made some pretty, startling or I think significant contributions to the way that people practice those sports, right? So then there, in some ways, it kind of got to the point where, in whatever sport you're talking about, to some extent, the stronger person is going to have a significant advantage. If you're going to, if you can run faster down the field, it doesn't matter how good the defender's tackling technique is. If they cannot catch you, they cannot catch you. And so you're going to score the points and you're going to do better in that sport, right? So it comes down to a lot of times strength. And I think over the past 20 years in particular, people are starting to realize that over on like the performing arts side, whether it's dance or music or, what have you, there's a lot more nuance to it than that. It's not necessarily about being the quote unquote strongest, performer within a group of people. There's nuance to the technique that people are using. And so theoretically, either anybody or a vast majority of those people could develop those high level techniques and essentially be the best performer. So that just became, from a scientific standpoint, something far more interesting to study. And so in the past 20 years, I think there's been a lot more interest in looking at the performing arts and looking at how people kind of refine stuff and get good at stuff. And so I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think that you find that there seems to be a bit of a not, I don't want to say a full migration, because the money is still coming from sports. That frankly is funding everything. Money and sports and military are funding everything. And so I think researchers are trying to get creative with tying in performing arts, because that actually leads to a lot of interesting things. That leads to a lot of interesting things in terms of how people learn stuff and get good at stuff. And that can translate to fifth graders trying to learn science, or stroke patients trying to regain coordination in their limbs, or Parkinson's patients developing their gait so that they can walk with better success. It all kind of feeds into that side of the fence as well.
Wow, very, very cool. It's so fun when we discover musicians like you, and the only other person that comes to mind is a past guest, Molly Gebrian, who I went to school with. She's a violist. We had her on the show. She has a minor in neuroscience, and she talks a lot about how you practice, and she's got a wonderful little lecture series online that I was so excited to share with my students this semester. But it's really cool because I think so many musicians out there, we do our thing and we do it well, but like we have no idea how we do it. Like we have no idea. It's like, Karli, how do you do that amazing thing with your hand, or how do you memorize that? It's like I don't know. It's like usually the answer like I have no idea. It's interesting, like how you, even if you have a ton of knowledge about something, doesn't necessarily mean you can do it. But then we meet people like yourself who they have the knowledge, and then they can teach the rest of us how to apply it.
Well, and that's flattering for you to say, but full disclosure, I think part of the reason why I even went down these rabbit holes was because as a brass player, I had a lot of struggle along the way. There were aspects of playing a brass instrument that did not come easily to me. And I had teachers who were very reputable teachers who, some aspects did come easily to them. So when I ran into these roadblocks and said, what do I do? A lot of times they would say, well, use more air, or, hear the sound in your head. I mean, there are some very basic pillars of the way that we do these things that, of course, ring true. But if that's not enough, like if that's not getting the results, and I need something else, there's something about the way that I'm doing it that's not the same as the way you're doing it. There are a lot of people out there that I think for whatever reason, didn't hit those same struggles, therefore didn't have to work through them, therefore may have a limited repertoire of ways to address those issues. And so, we almost see this divide between the highest level performers and the highest level teachers, in that the highest level performers, part of the reason they got that way is because they kind of climbed the ladder quickly. And part of the reason that happened is because they didn't really hit all those issues along the way. Things just kind of naturally worked out very well for them. Maybe it was that when they were, 5 years old, they had a piano teacher who told them to sit up straight. And so they had good posture. It just wasn't an issue for them. And then, next thing you know, they're teaching a graduate student who's got, really slouched shoulders and developing some shoulder pain. And they may not know what to say because it's not something that, really happened to them experientially. And so I think that the people that are making contributions are often people that just along the way had to find answers to something that they weren't able to find through mainstream channels. So I as flattered as I am, I don't think I'm unique in that. I think a lot of us have had to get creative in how we look at things that have come up. So
Gotcha.
That's kind of where I've come from on it.
I just wanted to chime in again. So sorry that I'm late, because I think this topic is so fascinating, and what you do, Jason, is just so incredible. And I too think that it's much better. Well, it's great to study with someone who is just naturally gifted, but then also with someone who has struggled a lot to overcome issues, because again, of what you said, these people know how to give you more concrete things to work on, as opposed to those who, just like Casey's best recipe is mango practice. I mean, that works, but Casey, I practice so much and it still doesn't work, and I need help.
Yeah, but look, so how many people it's okay, I can't get myself to focus on this for more than 5 minutes. I need some magic solution. So let me go read Anders Ericsson's book and Grit, and let me go spend 8 hours reading all the inner games of tennis and golf and da-da-da. It's wait, if you just one foot in front of the other for one 30-minute stretch, you would figure out how to do the basics. But I think it's Jason. So important because when we get to a point where we need deliberate practice, it's like, okay, well, what are the specific like solutions we need, and we need like a lot of things on our utility belt, Ksenija.
Yeah, I'm like the fly on the fly tape that can tell people to go this way. You know, I've taken the time to read all those books and take those courses and really dive in. And I very quickly realized that, you know, I'm pretty fortunate that I have the time and the means to be able to do this, the opportunity to be able to do this. So I think early on, I just realized that I need to do it with a mindset of, I'm going to have to bring this information back for a lot of people that don't have the time to take these classes and to read these books and to do these things. And so I think, you know, when we think about like the community of musicians or the community of learners, the community of students, whatever, I think we all have a role to play. And, you know, for me, I think just because I was fortunate that I was able to kind of do that, I just said, okay, cool. I'll figure out the best way to distill, you know, Anders Ericsson's deliberate practice into 5 minutes so that I can give that 5 minutes to somebody and then they can go and maybe get some progress. And if that doesn't work, fine, go read the book, you know, go take 4 hours and read all the stuff. But if the 5 minutes is enough to make it happen, because you're right, there is kind of a cost benefit trade-off to how far down other rabbit holes you go for searching, you know, for those answers. And it is possible that you can go all the way down one of those rabbit holes only to find that what you need is not down there. And then you have kind of lost that time, you know, of just being in the practice room and just essentially chopping out, where you may have just worked through it naturally. So it's a real gamble sometimes. And I think that maybe that's one of the reasons why it's a bit of a detractor to say, you know, yeah, go do all that stuff because it'll round out your teaching and your playing. Because, well, yeah, maybe, but it also might be a huge waste of time if you don't need it.
Well, and I like that you also said in your interview there on the Bulletproof Musician, which we're going to fire to Ben real soon to talk about, but you also said, depending on where the student's at, it's also really valuable, just like, hey, we just got to play. Like if you're really young, you just got to play, you know? And I've encountered students that are like, oh, I have practice problems. It's like, well, are you practicing much? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, then you don't need some magic solution yet. You just need to like practice one foot in front of the other until, you know, you're at least beating that 5-minute distraction mark, you know, then we can talk about special solutions, etc. So Ben, tell us what we were assigned this week.
Yeah, so Casey actually was generous enough to sort of send me a topic to go after this week, and it came from, Casey already mentioned, the Bulletproof Musician podcast, and it was an interview with Jason called On Why Fast at-Tempo Practice Can Be More Efficient and Effective Than Slow Practice. This is available online for free, so please go check that out for a much more in-depth discussion than what I'm about to do. But the proverb that came to mind as I read this, and this is something I use with my students a lot, and the proverb is, when the only tool in your toolkit is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And I think so often, like from a very young age, we're taught like slow the metronome down and then slowly click it back up. And the analogy that I always come up with for my students is like, I would love to be able to play Liszt on piano. I think it's just gorgeous, gorgeous music. But I can take La Campanella and put my metronome at 15 beats per minute and play it all day long, but I'm eventually going to run up to a tempo of probably 25 beats per minute where I can no longer do it. And it's just a roadblock. Like I'm not going to be able to just continually crank it up. And so as I listened to this podcast, like everything that Jason said just rang so true with that little like nugget in my wisdom that I've accumulated. So I figured that I would just sort of hit a few bullet points. And obviously we have the master of all this here. And it's so interesting to hear about the kinesiology background because that gives some more context to it. But just a few bullet points I wanted to point out. Jason talks about this idea of at-tempo practice. He says it has to be a strategic, organized method. It's not just like a substitute for, well, you can't do it slow, just go at it fast and see what happens. And so Jason brings up this study of kinesiology where it was some sort of target practice, was it? Like, it's not like archery or something like that with the trying to work faster?
Yeah, so a lot of the studies are based on, there were these two researchers, their names were Fitz and Posner, and they were in I think it was like 1955, something like that. And they essentially had a little stylus and they had like two squares like on the table and people had to tap back and forth, and speed and accuracy were measured in different contexts. But that's basically, I think, you know, what you're referring to.
Yeah, okay, that's what it was, yeah. And
Yeah.
so, but the problem with the study, Jason says, is that the goal for that study was speed as a concept of as fast as possible. Whereas musicians, our speed is actually like a target point. It's that we don't try and play something that's written at 160 beats per minute at 190 beats per minute, or at least most of us in this room don't. I'm looking at you, Casey. So anyway, Jason says that what this boils down to is slow practicing can involve some different technical things. For example, for wind players, breathing. If you're practicing so slow that a phrase takes twice as long, you might need twice as many breaths. And for percussionists, the thing that came to mind was roll basses on snare drum. It won't sound like a roll if you're doing it slowly. You can see how that would change. So anyway, then Jason says that it is important to note that replacing an existing habit requires deliberate, slow practice. So if you say learned a note wrong, it is important to go back down. But we ended up with this point called chaining, which is something that I do, and I've never really thought about a name for it, but Jason stuck a name to it. And basically chaining is the idea that you master a very small bit of music and then you master another small bit and you add them together. And he has different terms like micro chaining, which is like if you had a measure of 16th notes, you would do the first and the second, first, second, third, and so on, versus macro chaining, which is like the first beat, then the second beat, then the third beat, and then you start clumping the different beats together. And he has all these other interesting concepts like proportional macro chaining that you can listen to the episode for what those mean. But so basically the idea is that you learn small chunks at tempo and you put them together. And I remember a very long time ago, I heard about the marimba player Janice Potter does this in her practice. I can't speak to the accuracy of that statement, but I did hear through the grapevine that she did that. And then Jason talks about using a metronome. And he says that they've done studies, and even at like the highest level of session drum set players, there's always a variance in tempo. That's just a human thing. So a lot of people are concerned that a metronome will turn you into some sort of robotic player, and he says it will not. But beyond that, he says it's important to use one that deletes beats so that you don't end up relying on the metronome, which I find is an interesting concept. Like, can you keep in time over the course of 7 beats without 7 clicks in there? And then one last thing I wanted to point out from this little podcast that I found very interesting, and I think it sort of might somewhat answer Casey's question about like the freshman student that can't practice for 5 minutes a day. Jason talks about 4 different levels of success: survival, competency, proficiency, and mastery. And Jason says, you could probably divide it in 20, but it's easy for us to boil it down to 4. And basically survival is like, hey, Karli, I have a gig tonight. There's a really hard xylophone part and I've, broken my arm. I can't make it. Can you be at the gig in an hour? And so at that point, you're just trying to sort of get the notes together. And then obviously you can see how competency, proficiency, and mastery would build up beyond that. And I would imagine in Casey's hypothetical, but maybe not so hypothetical situation of that freshman student, you can tell them like, you are practicing to survival. You are practicing to get through the next rehearsal or to get through the next lesson when you need to practice beyond that. Now, obviously that doesn't fix the practice, but I thought that was an interesting analogy for that. So yeah, does anyone, I have a couple other little nuggets of my own personal stuff, but I wanted to open up to Jason or anyone else that wanted to jump in.
Well, I was just going to add to that, Ben. It seems like sometimes the challenge is not I don't know what to do when I get in there. It's I just can't get in there.
Yeah, there is that. Yeah.
It's like that's the like there's this mental block.
That Caleb?
For some reason, it's just like a discipline problem. I've had breakthroughs with students where I've simply said, "Hey, like practicing doesn't have to be fun."
Is that Caleb? Is Caleb the one that's
Caleb all the way? Still to this day has his DMA and all. No, but like simply saying, "Hey, it's okay if like it's not fun. It's work." It can be. It really can be work. And you don't go in the practice room to play for yourself and feel good about yourself as a musician. You go in there to get better. And then all of a sudden, like boom, they have like a wonderful week. So yeah, but.
I'm glad I'm not the only one having that conversation. I've had that, I feel, too many times this semester. It makes me feel a little better. Practicing is sometimes it feels like work, right?
Well, and it's interesting to me too, like, of course, we've been talking about physicality a lot so far, but when we talk about the mental considerations, like how the heck did Steve Schick memorize SOFA, rebonds, bone alphabet, XY, like all his rep? And of course, we know his answer. Likewise, how did Keiko Abe memorize Remember the Spiritual after just getting the score and flying to the premiere, memorizing it on the plane, and then performing it? How does Morris Palter memorize rebonds? And they all have the same answer. Well, I start with the first note, then I go to the next note. It's just like one foot in front of the other, until they're done.
Keiko Abe has a photographic memory too, which helps.
Yeah. One thing I thought also related to this, I thought I'd ask Jason what you think about this statement, and feel free to rip it apart if it's no good, but it seems like it's, speaking of practice survival, I said to a class recently, it's very easy, I think, to waste time in the practice room for very short-term goals, such as a survival goal, like, man, I got to learn this part in an hour. Okay, well, if you got to learn this part in an hour, then there's a very couple of specific things you need to do, and only those things to get that done. However, it's very hard, it's like almost impossible to waste practice time on the long term. So for instance, if I just walked over to this snare drum and just played straight quarter notes for 2 hours, 2 days straight, like, it would be a spiritual awakening, like a John Cage style, like, enlightenment to do that for 2 days straight. That would impact all my performances from then on. So is that going to help any short-term goal? No, probably not. But is that a waste of time? It's hard to say if that's a waste of time.
No, I feel like it's pretty easy to say that.
Okay.
I think that's a waste of time.
Awesome.
That's because you're a percussionist.
But think
Well,
about
and it's funny, it's funny when you started playing, I was like, oh, that's Schitt's Creek. I was like, we just needed a tuba, when they the next scene. But anyway, I don't know if you're fans of the show or have seen
I like the show. Yeah, I'm not caught up, but I do like it.
Fair enough. So the research of Anders Ericsson, which is the deliberate practice research, one of the pillars of deliberate practice is that it's supposed to be very challenging and very draining and not really gratifying. The gratification may come from, having breakthroughs and having success, but the actual rigor is supposed to be rigorous. I would argue that there are like 5 different kinds of like verb, like action verb in terms of practicing and playing and performing and preparing and all that stuff. So if I'm practicing, that means that I'm working on things I do not do well and I want to get better at those things, right? If I am preparing, that means I am learning repertoire, which is not necessarily the same as getting better as a trombonist, right? There are things, now I may as a byproduct get a little better at the trombone through that repertoire, but I think there are things that I need to work on that are not necessarily linked with the repertoire. They may exist in the repertoire, right? So there's practicing, and then there are times where I might just play for fun, and that's gratifying and it massages my soul, and that might help feed my long-term interest in continuing, but that's just playing. That's not necessarily practicing. I'm not necessarily preparing repertoire. And then there's performing. Now performing, I'm not chopping anything out. I'm not getting better at again, there are always going to be byproducts and bleed over through categories. Like when I perform, I get a little bit better at performing. Therefore I do get a little better, or I might learn some very valuable lessons on the journey. But when I'm kind of thinking about everything, I think that there's practice time, there's preparation time, there's playing time, there's performing time. So I kind of really try to separate those out, when I'm kind of talking. So for me, when I'm talking about practicing, that's absolutely not the fun stuff. That is the bowl of broccoli with nothing on it that I need to eat so I will be healthy and strong. And like that's what that is for me. Now, if I do a certain amount of practicing, I may then reward myself with some playing, or I may get to reward myself with some performing, so there's that. But to tie into your other point about like, and I know you just use the example of like, we'll call them quarter notes for days, like on a snare, just single, hits on the snare. I think no matter what we're talking about in terms of short-term goals or long-term goals, there's a cost. Any time that you spend doing anything is a cost. And Brian, before we kind of got rolling, was mentioning that I deal and I work in practice units, and everything I do is split up into like 15-minute units of time. those units are a cost. I can only get so many units in a day. My students can only get so many units in a day. And you could say it's because we mentally get fatigued, or we physically get fatigued, or we run out of time, or, you know, we run out of motivation to just go after the hard stuff. But there's a finite resource that we have, you know, at our disposal. And it's a little different for everyone. It depends on how motivated you are. It depends on how open your schedule is, whatever. But it's a cost. And so if you play 2 days of like one thing, that may or may not be like pouring cement into some long-term technical growth, yeah, you're right, you may get that benefit. But I think it might, to me, it sounds like it would be way too costly for anyone.
Right. Well, I guess, yeah, if you didn't have any specific urgent goals, which I think doesn't apply to any of us, we all do, but it's sort of like, imagine if John Cage said, oh, I have this deficiency in my ear training, thus he didn't, and he tried to fix it, he spent a lot of time fixing it, he would just be another boring composer. It's because of his deficiency that he didn't fix that he had to be so outward and creative. And actually, just, I know my example is really silly and I don't recommend anyone do that, but Giacinto Scelsi, the composer Giacinto Scelsi, like, he's like, has like, nobody else sounds like that guy. He's one of my favorite contemporary composers. I mean, he was known for when a composer buddy would walk up to a piano and like entertain guests and play a little ditty, he would just go up to a piano and just literally like listen for the universe in that one little note. And that's like, those are the like central pillars in his pieces, like everything. And he'd do the same thing with gongs. You know, he's like, he would say there's these central organisms that his whole universe kind of explodes from, that's like a single center pitch. So it's weird, like, yeah, but and then again, he is not a normal composer by any stretch of the word. So I guess that's what I meant, like short-term goal, yeah, worthless, but would that pay off in some benefit? I don't know, you know, maybe. It's like I think about playing Steve Reich and the mental capacity it takes to play, like actually play piano phase. You know, for 20 minutes, play the same thing over and over. It's like, man, if you can concentrate on something that simple as quarter notes on a snare drum for a day straight, yeah, you're gonna have the mental chops to play all Steve Reich. Just a theory, though. I've not tested this. I should test it on some students, see what happens.
Well, and it's possible that, I mean, I think the people that will test it are people that have to do that. Like if there's a piece and it's on somebody's stand and they got to learn it, then they're gonna have to develop the mental chops to really go after that in a meaningful way.
Right.
But I think that's different in developing physical technique toward playing the instrument.
Of course,
you know,
of course, yeah.
It's not the same as chops that you need to do other things. It's a certain type of technique. So you're right. For most of us, I would say that's too costly. But if it's on your stand, if it's on your to-do list, if it's on your calendar, then yeah, you got to pay up. Like you got to get that. So you know that's where the environment kind of determines that for you.
For sure, for sure. Okay, I haven't been paying attention in the chat. I see you guys are tooling on me a lot.
It's all right. We're talking about diapers in the chat. But speaking of the chat, we seriously, for one of these episodes, we need to have like a Patreon perk where you get the chat overlaid on the episode, because there was a little nugget from Jason in our little text chat earlier that I wanted to touch on. Jason said, I would argue that if you are having fun, you are just playing, you aren't practicing. And Ksenija kind of was like, can't learning be fun? And I had a little thing I wanted to share about that I've thought of several times before. I think there's a difference between having fun and enjoying something. And you can enjoy work, but having fun to me is something different. And I think it maybe I'm just being too like pedantic about this or something, but I have said many times before, like I don't find practicing fun. I find performing fun. I find practicing maybe rewarding and enjoyable, but I don't find going into the practice room under terrible lighting all on my own with earplugs in and a metronome on my phone. That's not my idea of like a good time. But one thing that, and that's just my opinion, I'm not trying to say that I'm like right on that, but one thing this brings up, and I've thought about doing this with my students, but I've never actually done it. I've actually thought about banning the word play for music. So you can perform music, you can rehearse music, you can practice music, you can record music, but playing music to me like conjures up an image of just like a drum circle, which it's fine, but like in the college practice room, I don't know that like we need like a bunch of like people sitting around in a drum circle. So I don't know. I'm sure Ksenija will disagree with me on this, but I'm not like sticking by that as a hard rule or anything. To be clear, I'm not.
I can't stand hippies, Ben.
But you know, like, I don't know, it's just like, to me, like, that's like, as a Western classical musician, I'll call myself, that's like, to me, I don't have fun in the practice room. It's just kind of what I'm trying to say.
But we've talked so many times about the value of play, that whole like idea.
Yeah, I guess I'm just not a very fun
You've
person.
just been hating that idea for years.
No, and
It's a different,
that's why
it's a different skill.
yeah, I'm approaching it with so much caution, because like when you say it out loud, it's like, what do you mean you can't play music? Like, you can't have fun playing music? It's like, no, that's like not what I mean. I'm specifically talking about in terms of like, we're talking about practicing here. So I guess maybe that's what I'm saying, is it's important to me to divorce like the idea of like playing music and practicing music, which I think a point, maybe that's like a better way of saying it, if that makes sense.
And I would take this to a direction of Maslow's hierarchical needs. You know, and something that anyone who's taken a psychology course in college has probably been exposed to this, but or like a grad music ed course or something, where you know, to reach that level of self-actualization, which is kind of like the highest level of, you know, satisfaction, you know, in one's life, it starts with basic needs, you know, food, air, water, that kind of thing, and then it kind of goes up from there. I think the ultimate goal is that we all get good enough to where we're just playing. Like if your practice is getting you to a level to where you can play anything, then it is just playing when you go to play that thing. And then when you find things that you can't play well, then, well, okay, I got to go practice so I can, you know, get this thing. But wouldn't it be great if you just got to the point to where you are just playing all the time? And so I think that that's, you know, an important distinction, that it's like that aspirational goal, that horizon is to get to the point to where you're just playing it. But the truth is, you know, when we get to the point to where we're just playing, I think that means we're not necessarily getting better. And so what I find is that I do find gratification when I go to the practice room and I go after the nitty gritty, and because there's a bit of a dopamine hit when I come up with a solution or I make a breakthrough on it, and I feel good about the progress that I make. And that's what we want all of our students to have. Like, we want them to develop that kind of psychological game where it becomes something where they say, yeah, I feel gratified by that. But I also know that if I start feeling too good about it, that means that I've got it. Like, I need to go find other things that I need to practice. It means that I've kind of turned a corner on that. And that's no longer the thing that is the most efficient thing for me to be doing right now, because there must be weaknesses somewhere else, you know, in a dark corner somewhere that would not be fun to go after right now. And I think the players that continue to kind of climb whatever ladders matter to us are the players that constantly say, okay, you know, let's get out of the comfort zone. Let's find the things I'm the worst at. Let's always go after those things that are the most frustrating. And, you know, I think for a lot of players, you know, because we all know players that have a stupid amount of chops, like they have maybe even more chops that they would need. But, you know, maybe taking auditions is something that they haven't really just figured out the mental game for. And so for them, that's something they would need to practice, but they don't seem to go in that direction effectively enough to then, you know, kind of break through and, you know, start advancing or win those jobs or whatever. So in a way, if they're just continuing to like chop out on Porgy, you know, then maybe that's not practicing for them anymore, because they're fine on that, you know. So I do think that it all kind of ties in. And, you know, I'm sure we all kind of maybe use slightly different words or, you know, kind of approach it with, you know, a slightly different take verbally, but I think we're all basically barking up the same tree on it.
Well, and it just, everyone put a few examples in the chat. The one I remember is Pablo Casals saying, I don't remember him saying this, I read it somewhere, obviously, but yeah, it said, if you're sounding good in the practice room, you're not practicing right. So it's that I think it's down that same thread.
Yeah, and I've changed on that one, because there was a long time, because I had some teachers that said, you know, you use the repertoire to develop the technique, because the repertoire tells you what technique you need in order to be successful in the industry. And so they would do it through the repertoire. I've 180 on that in my, you know, I'm now in my 40s, and I do the opposite of that. I avoid the repertoire like the plague, so I do not ingrain any lackluster habits within the repertoire itself. And I find other creative ways to just continue to develop my technique, so that when I put the repertoire back in front of me, it's fresh and it's not like beaten to death with like mediocre habits.
Right.
Because I mean, how many people have like a B rate version of insert percussion excerpt here? Like, there's a million people that can play that reasonably well, but to play it like really, really well, I mean, if you have 1,000 mediocre repetitions at that rep, of that piece, it's going to be really hard to train that out and replace that with a high level habit. So I find that if I can avoid the repertoire, or if I can avoid the kind of repertoire that would come up for like auditions. So there are certain solos and certain, and pretty much excerpts. I don't really practice at all until an audition comes up, and then there's a list, and then I'll hit that list. But I don't live and breathe, like I don't play the Ride unless I have to. The Ride of the Valkyries is a pretty big trombone one. I don't touch that unless I have to, because I'm just going to be reinforcing like 42-year-old Jason's version of that. And 45-year-old Jason's going to be way better than 42-year-old Jason. So why, when I'm 45, would I want to be stuck with those 42-year-old Jason habits within that piece that I now have to like train out of that? That's going to double the amount of time. That's just not cost effective.
And that's when you would engage in a specific type of deliberate practice to get that back to where you had it 5 years ago, rather than just get up and play it not your best.
Just talking about the kind of the like what Ben was saying, to play music versus to practice music, perform music. Like, we're all kind of looking for that motivation at the end of the day, right? And I know, Jason, you and I have talked about is it Doug Yo from Boston Symphony? He's
Yes.
got a quote that is in every one of our practice rooms here, and I'm sure all of you probably heard this. That he's got this kind of this feedback loop idea of, if you practice, you get better. If you get better, you play with better musicians. If you play with better musicians, you play better music. If you play better music, you have more fun. If you have more fun, you want to practice more. If you practice more, you get better. And so it's this great feedback loop that just works perfectly well. I mean, some of that may be not fun, but it's the thing before or the thing after that's the fun, that's the carrot that allows you to continue forward.
And just to clarify as well, like when I'm teaching beginners, it's all about playing and all about fun, because we're just trying to establish habits that going to the instrument is fun. And I think that at some point, that slowly and best case scenario is we do it without them even noticing, that they start to incorporate things that they're practicing, and then they feel that gratification from when they get better and they get to do cooler stuff, and then it's more gratifying, makes them want to get back into that practice room, and then that cycle just kind of organically starts up and kind of takes off. I would never, with like a 5th or a 6th grader, I would never say, oh, you got to get into that practice room and eat your broccoli, because like then 80% of them are going to say, I'm going to go do another activity. I don't really want to do this. And so I think it is important that when the student, if we're talking about students and if we're talking about developing players, when they are ready to take the next step, that's when I, as a teacher, will kind of say, okay, we've got to up the game on, the practice, the not fun part of it, the rigor of it, so you can get to that higher level game that's being played by others. But usually I kind of let students determine that, either through their playing or through what they say in lessons or through their practice logs. There is evidence that they are ready to kind of go up to those next levels. And I have some students that aren't, frankly. All the evidence seems to suggest that they are fine with the level that they're at. And then, we can argue about how successful they will be in college or whatever, in their degree program, or if they fail lessons or whatever. That's a different conversation. But I think just in general, when players are ready for the next level of commitment, I mean, it's like a relationship. When you're ready for the next level of commitment, it's pretty obvious to the people that are in that relationship, or at least it should be. And I think it's a similar thing, really.
So Jason, this is perfect, since you brought up like the practice logs and stuff, because I remember when you and I first met, one of the things that I really liked was in watching how you were teaching your students was this idea of the practice units and stuff like that. And I had already been doing this a little bit with just like these 20-minute, I would practice for 20 minutes, I would have an alarm set, and then when that happened, I got to take a 5-minute break. And I know there's actually, I think there's some sort of Japanese technique behind it. It comes from something else as well. I can't remember what, but then you have it all broken down into like a very, very specific, you have a much more systematic approach to that. And I think that it works perfectly for percussionists, because we have so many rather different skill sets in a lot of ways to break into. Oh, I got to practice marimba today, and then I also got to work on my snare drum. And by the way, I gotta play crash cymbals on Romeo and Juliet this weekend, so I got to practice that. And we have so many different things that we need to practice in a lot of ways that your system works so well. Could you maybe just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, happy to. So I just use the word units because I couldn't think of a better word. So I call them units. But basically for me, a unit of practice is, roughly 15 minutes of deliberate practice toward something. So I'm one of two sets of twins. I have two older brothers that are twins, and then I have a twin sister. And so there were four of us all growing up, and we all went into different kind of career professions. And what the eldest brother, I don't want to say my other brother, but the eldest brother, Derek, is a mechanic, and he works for a company called Lexus, and he lives in Connecticut, and he's been working on cars his whole life. He loves cars. He's really great at diagnosing problems and fixing things, and good, he's good with people. And so it all works out, right? Well, I learned through him that in the mechanic industry, there's actually something called an ASE master certification, where you get certified in 8 different categories of automotive repair, whether it's brakes or HVAC or, whatever, power steering, transmission, all that stuff. But one of the things that I found interesting in the world of mechanics in terms of how you get billed, like when you take your car in for service, there's a certain way that they bill you, and it's called flat rate. And what flat rate means is that when you take your car into, let's say, whatever shop, and you go and get an oil change, they're going to charge you their shop labor rate for 15 minutes. Now, if there's a hot shop mechanic who can do it in 4 minutes, you still pay 15 minutes worth of shop time. So if that shop charges $60 an hour for labor, you're paying $15 in labor for that oil change. And it doesn't matter how long that oil change takes. If the person doing it ends up getting like explosive diarrhea and has to go to the bathroom, and they come back 45 minutes later and they can't find the oil filter, and it ends up taking like an hour and a half to change your oil, it still only costs 15 minutes. And I think there's something that is really great about the fact that it's a standard rate. So in my own practice, I said, okay, I'm going to figure out what I can do in 15 minutes on such and such a topic. So let's say articulation, right? I'm going to come up with a bunch of little exercises, 2-3 minutes each, whatever. And if I do all these exercises, it takes me about 15 minutes, right? Maybe 17 minutes because I'm still learning it. But after a couple of days, I can work it down to about 15 minutes. All right, something's a little rusty or something doesn't speak well, and I want to take a little moment. It might take me 16 minutes. I still bill it as a 15-minute unit of time. So one of the things that's great about that is I don't have to micromanage the counting. It's like, that's 15 minutes in my mind. It's 1 unit. It's done. Like that's the end of the conversation. Now I do it on a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And when you go to the bottom of each, so every day has like a bunch of spots where I can add in like the units and type in what I do and all that stuff. And so if I do the same kinds of exercises, I can just copy and paste. So that saves time. But then also at the end of every day, I made it so it auto totals the number of blocks that I've entered information, essentially done practice, right? So if I do 6 units, if I do 4 units, if I do 10 units, and then all I have to do is highlight that row, and I can look up a week or a month or a year and say, and then the Excel spreadsheet will tell me, oh, you've practiced 742 units, you've averaged 4.2 units a day over, these whatever. And the thing that's really great about that is that with my studio at school, everybody has an Excel spreadsheet, and then they've shared it with me through our OneDrive, which is like the Google sharing, whatever, for our university. So when I sign into a lesson, I'm looking at their practice spreadsheet, and I'm able to say, okay, well, your 7-day average is 3.4, but if you look at your 100-day average, it's only 2.8. So you've been practicing a little more this week compared to your regular amount. So things are probably going to be sounding better. Or I can say, like, let's say they play an etude and it sounds like bad. It just sounds bad. Well, we can look back and say, well, how many units did you get on it? And they could say, oh, okay, well, I only got 3 units on it. Oh, okay, it sounds like you've done about 3 units on it. This is going to be a 10-unit piece. You need 7 more units on this before it's really going to start to lock in. So on the one hand, it makes it very clear when you're doing the work or when you're not doing the work. But on the other hand, you can cut yourself some slack when you look back and see that you're just earlier in the journey than you thought. And there are times where students can get really discouraged because in their mind, they've done all this work on X, Y, Z. But if you look back and you actually just count it, you can say, no, you actually aren't that far along yet. You're only 10 units in. This is going to take you 50 units. And then they could say, oh, okay, all right, well, if I'm getting 3 units a week and I got to get 40 more units, like then it becomes a thing that, you can kind of just plan out like emotionally and psychologically as well. And I also really like it because, I get some students that, I don't know if you have this, but I get students that if they don't make the top ensemble, they get a little salty, and they're, oh, Billy made the top ensemble and I didn't make the top. And I can say, well, Billy's averaging about 6.4 units a day over the past 4 months. And let's look at your practice log. Oh, you're about 2.7. So Billy's just out practicing you, you're just getting outplayed. And it just takes away all of the ego and the emotion that can very easily be attached to some of those things that we really value kind of going up through the system. So I have found it really helpful for me, but I've also found it really helpful for my students in my studio and they're all at different levels of play and they're all in different places. And I have some students that just aren't used to writing anything down. So in those first couple of weeks, they'll be like, 3 units, like total. And they probably lied about 2 of them, right? They're just not practicing. And so from there, what I can do, and just to tie in some music ed terms, because Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, if a student is a 3 unit per week student, my goal is to get them to an 8 unit per week student. Let's just try to add 1 unit a day for a couple of days. When they become an 8 unit student, then my goal is to get them to maybe a 12 unit student. And then next thing you know, it kind of starts feeding and feeding and feeding. And the more units they get, the better they get, the more gratifying it is. Maybe they get into that higher ensemble. It's more fun to play. They want to practice. They start getting, when they've got 3 units a day, 6 days in a row, and then they get to that 7th day, I think there's something psychologically that makes us want to fill in those 3 blocks, and so I think there could be like a quasi motivational factor with it as well. So that's just some of the ways that I've kind of used this whole unit thing and the practice log thing. But for me, it also keeps me honest. There's a field of study called heuristics, which looks at how people solve problems, right? And actually the most common ways that it's been studied are animals foraging for food, speed dating, and games of chance, like gambling, right? And one of the things that's interesting about the animals foraging for food is that they look at like birds, right? They like fly up to a shrub and start eating berries off the shrub. Well, at some point, they've eaten like X number of berries off the shrub, and then they look over and there's that shrub over there, and that shrub is full of berries. And so at some point, they've recognized that that shrub is a greater concentration of food and resource, so I'm gonna fly over there. And they bail on that first shrub. Some birds will eat all the berries, every last berry, and then they will fly over to the other shrub. Some birds will eat a couple of berries and then be like, oh, what's over there? Shiny object, right? And this kind of relates to an explore versus exploit paradigm, or some people might refer to it as like ADD, OCD, where some people are going to eat every last berry. They're going to play the quarter notes for 2 days on the snare drum, and they're not going to get to all these other things in the practice room that they really need to get to. So I bring this up because I learned pretty early on that I am on the OCD side. I am I am a card carrying member of like that side in terms of the way that I just approach practicing without thinking about it. So I realized that if I do 15-minute units and I set a timer, and when the timer goes off, I move on to something else. That keeps me from digging down these rabbit holes of spending an hour on lip slurs and never getting to articulation or getting to intonation, because I need to get to those things, right? So if I were a percussionist, I could imagine that if you need to do 15 minutes of xylo, and you need to do 15 minutes of snare, and you need to do 15 minutes of water gong, and it could be a way that for some students who would just chop out on marimba all day long, it gets them to kind of switch gears in a more balanced manner, more distributed manner. So, it seems like it helps a lot of people. If you're ADD, then you can work up the ability to last 15 minutes on a thing, right? And like there can be a challenge to that. And then eventually you can kind of work up to that skill. If you're more on the OCD side, it can keep you from falling into those rabbit holes. So either way, it kind of brings everybody to more of the middle, which I think is a good, a more productive place to be, so.
Oh, you muted, Jason.
I feel like that was a lot. I feel like I just did a big data dump on that, so I hope that wasn't too much.
No, that was excellent. I was going to say, are all trombonists this informed? We need to have more trombonists on the show. Percussionists never to say any of this stuff. This is really great.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that there's a wide variety of trombonists. I don't know. Try to avoid those hangs.
I think it's interesting how a lot of folks who describe their practice recommendation for students, and they have these like really good thought out fine routines, they discover them through teaching. Like, it's interesting, like few people who report on, Anders Ericsson's book or Angela Duckworth's book, they say like, here's how I did it, here's how I achieved. But it's people who've achieved and then are saying like, hey, this makes sense to me, I relate to this. Just speaking to like how meticulous, how methodical do you be, or are you just an automatic type of practicer? Guys, I can't follow the chat. I have no idea if like there was a me or not. Was there a me?
Can we actually wrap soon, because I got to go practice my water gong tonight.
15 minutes. I was going to say 15 minutes is more than probably as much water gong as I've ever practiced.
I will say that there are several things that I practice that I only do like 3 minutes of it. And so I fit 5 of those things within a 15-minute unit of time. So it might be 3 minutes of water gong, 3 minutes of some other obscure instrument. Help me out here, Brian. 3 minutes of, I don't know.
Water triangle.
Prepared piano.
Water bass drum. Ben, I think you're up.
Yeah, well, I had a couple things, and one I think is a good way of sort of summing up what Brian started talking about with that little practice room mantra that they have on the walls, and Jason's been talking about. One thing I tell my students a lot is like, we think of practicing as moving your wrists, but also like you practice practicing. Like practicing is a mental thing, and like someone like Steve Schick can probably go and have a 6-hour practice session, but a college undergrad student, I don't think will get that much out of sitting in a practice room for 6 hours straight. And then I had one other thing. I wanted to put something out there and see if anyone else has anything to add. That little proverb that I brought up about when the only tool you have in your toolkit is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. A lot of the time when I have students that get stuck on something, I try and pull out a different practice technique. And are you guys familiar with the penny practice technique? Have you ever heard of this? So like, if you're unfamiliar, basically there's like this like legend, and it's probably true somewhere, but there's a famous violinist, and every time he went to practice, he took a bag of 100 pennies and he would dump them out on the stand. And he would play a difficult passage correctly. One time he would move a penny over. He would play it again, move a penny over. And then if you make a mistake and you mess up, you don't move one penny back, you move all the pennies back. Which can sort of simulate performance pressure. And by the time you get to the 99th repetition, you do not want to miss that note and have to move all pennies back and start over. And obviously 100 is quite a bit. I usually start students on like 5 or 10 with a very short passage. But if you can imagine doing that with like Porgy and Bess, and you build up larger and larger sections with more and more pennies till the point that you can play the entire xylophone excerpt 100 times through completely error-free. And the penny thing really, with the rare occasions when I do it, which admittedly is very rare, like it absolutely forces concentration. I am never so focused as when I'm doing that. And we've talked about what I call the additive practicing method, which is what we call practicing at tempo, we discussed with Jason. But does anyone else have any like unique practice methods that they suggest to students? And also practicing with timers, which is another thing I do.
I just do the George Hamilton Greens. Like I have that same. I've heard that same thing. I used to have a little cup with 10 pennies, and when I was doing that, but I get the same thing from the George Hamilton Green stuff when I'm practicing, and it's like, do this 20 times, don't miss a note, or do this for 2 minutes without stopping, or like all that stuff. And side note, I remember that I was starting to do that stuff when I was studying with Andy Harnsberger, and I remember screwing up one night, like after a first few lessons, I was working on those things, and I was like, well, I got to like a minute 50 or whatever, and then I screwed up, so no big deal. And then I stopped, and I heard myself, I thought to myself, all right, wait, if Harnsberger were here, what would he say right now? And I could just see like this little tiny Andy Harnsberger, I'm like yelling at me like, did you do it? No, go back, start again. And it's just like, oh, there we go. So there's that.
What other voices can you do, Brian?
Harnsberger. What's that?
What other voices can you do?
I've got a pretty good Christopher Dean.
Let's hear it.
And a pretty good Nate Rosario.
Go.
This reminds me, there was this thing that I saw on Facebook a few years ago, and it was at UNT. Someone put a photo and it said, practice how you perform. And it was right before juries. And they had taken all the percussion professors and put their pictures on the wall. So they were staring at you.
I have that somewhere. I saw that on Facebook too, and I thought it was hilarious because they had like a giant one of Daksha Troma. I remember.
I like that you. I really like how you describe practicing slow is not this like magic thing that I think a lot of times people think it is. And I always do it with my students, just speaking to Ben's question, are there any other practice things? So of course, you also mentioned that, I call it acquisition. Like when you're acquiring the music, just like getting it in your hands, getting in your head. Yeah, you absolutely should like start slow and work those notes into your hands. But man, like for stickings, for instance, like how you stick something at half tempo might be completely useless at tempo. I mean, just think of anything, even just something two mallet. I mean, how you stick that, I mean, it may be totally, totally different. So I always in lessons say like, hey, okay, that was great, that was slow. Can you just play like a few bars at tempo? Let's see what that feels like. Or let's see what that lick feels like. Play the lick. Yeah, see, that sticking's not going to work. It works at half tempo, but it won't even be realistic at full tempo. So yeah, you got to check in with at tempo.
Well, and I think the stickings are, that probably relates very easily to trombone alternate slide positions. Like there are times where I play notes in a close position and times where I have to extend the slide really far to play it, like the same note. And at a slow tempo, I can do whatever. But if I have to play it at the faster tempo, there are certain patterns that I need to use. But I think it goes deeper than that. Like if you get into the kinesiology side of it, if you think about every muscle that goes into your arm, for example, or your shoulder or whatever, that is a part of like, playing the mallet. Every single muscle has a certain amount of like force production and a certain timing that it is coordinated in concert with the other muscles as they engage, right? At a slow tempo, there might be a certain recipe of like, this muscle and this muscle and this muscle. But then when you go at a faster tempo, it is possible that it is a completely different recipe. Like this muscle is actually more engaged in order to make the arm move faster. And so the concept of scaling becomes really important. Not everything in terms of human movement and action is completely scalable all across the spectrum of tempo and relative time. And so there's a lot of times where you can get caught up in just the wrong scale. And so, that's kind of a trickier concept. So I don't really get into it too much. I just say, let's come up with creative ways to practice at tempo. But the truth is, if you went a little bit slower or a little bit faster, but it was the same amount of scaling in terms of what the body's doing to make it happen at that tempo, you're probably fine. But I think that there are a lot of times where people can, like go half tempo thinking they're just going to be really, really, really accurate when, yeah, they might be really, really, really accurate at that slow tempo, but it's just not going to scale up, like you said. So, I mean, there's, in my opinion, some legit physical concerns, for that not just scaling up.
Yeah.
I've heard that's, I was sorry, I was just say I've heard that's why some people use like alternating stickings for porgy and best, because like the faster you go, you don't get caught up in a weird double somewhere. Sorry, Karli. Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is when I was listening to the Bulletproof Musician podcast and reading the article and thinking about all this, my question for Jason and all of you, if anybody wants to jump in, is do you think this method of practicing at tempo is more useful for experienced musicians and maybe more challenging for younger musicians? Because what Casey mentioned about figuring out stickings, like we all as experienced musicians have a sense of, will this work at tempo or do I need to change things? And we know to check that. Or earlier in the episode, Ben mentioned roll bass, and we know to figure out the roll bass for the whole etude or the whole solo in advance. But I see some of my younger students struggle with this and maybe don't know what to do with that. So what do you think about that, Jason?
I mean, to be honest, I actually think it's more valuable the younger you are and kind of the earlier you are in the development of even your basic motor patterns and schema to play the instrument at all. And I think that the pieces, fifth graders might be playing like Big Rock Candy Mountain or something, right? And so the demands are just not as crazy. I mean, if you think back to beginner band, ensembles, I can only imagine the dearth of percussion parts, or I should say part, that probably existed in the back of the room. They weren't that complicated. And so the physical demands of what you needed to play that probably weren't crazy. So to play it and to practice it at tempo, it's probably not that big of a stretch. But the concept of practicing it at tempo, I think will pay off down the line. Not only are you developing a lifestyle habit of being able to, embrace that as a practice methodology, but I think if you are developing those slightly faster motor patterns and learning how to coordinate them, I think when the rep does get harder, you will be more capable to kind of chew through that and learn that. And so I think that younger students can benefit just as much. And the difference is, and I guess it depends on how you look at it, but we all love dopamine, and we all love, success and being correct, and getting through things. We like getting the gold star on the practice chart or whatever. We've all had experiences where we've gotten these little, pats on the back, for like little successes. Yeah, Thad just ripped through some Firefly over there. It's one of his faves, right? But there's something to be said for that. And if you slow the metronome down and then you can like play it correctly, then yeah, you get that little hit of dopamine that you were successful. But I think if we can just switch the game so that, if you're just playing a couple of notes and you play through it correctly, then that can also be equally as gratifying. But that's where the teacher kind of comes in and can kind of reinforce and define that as being a really good, a good thing, a thing worthy of praise. So I think even from a psychological standpoint, with younger students, I don't see any detriment to teaching them the concept of at tempo practice. And I will go, and I know trombone, yada yada, who wants to talk about that. But when I had finished my coursework, I had about 3 years before I got a full-time college teaching position. And so it's actually kind of a funny life story. But I basically was living in Bloomington at the time, Indiana, and I was playing and teaching all over the state of Indiana to the point where paying rent made no sense. So I bought a $6,000 used beat up crappy RV, and I lived in it and just traveled around and did all my gigs. And so I slapped some solar panels on the roof, and I put a garden on the back, and I lived in it for 2 years and just drove around and like did all the gigs. Literally had a middle school call the cops on me because I was that guy in the RV in the school's parking lot, like in between lessons before I was going to go teach one student in period 1 and I had a student in period 3. So I was like writing drill in my RV for a high school band, like during period 2, and the cop shows up, right? He's like, "Hey, how you doing?" I'm like, I was doing
what the hell are you doing here, buddy?
I think things just took a turn here, right? But my point of the story is that I was teaching about 50 fifth graders, sixth graders, seventh graders, eighth graders. And some of them were beginners, like never touched a horn before, they're just starting out. And I did all this stuff with them. We never slowed anything down. We chunked, we chained, we did all like whatever the buzzwords, like we did all the things. I did it the same way that I do with my college students. The only difference is the scope of the repertoire, and technical repertoire as well as musical repertoire, was a little more simple, because they were playing beginner repertoire and beginner technical level stuff. But the techniques were the same, and there was no issue with that because they're still human beings. Like, if we think about human beings from like a motor learning standpoint, a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old versus a 17-year-old, they're not that much different in terms of their coordination, their ability to like move their bodies. There's a wide range of people in terms of their coordination in general. But it's not like all 12-year-olds are like, caterpillars. And then when they're 17, they're butterflies. There's not like that kind of metamorphosis change that's going to happen in terms of their abilities to like learn motor patterns. So I just, in my experience, I didn't find any detriment even working with younger students. So that's cool. Probably a long answer and a couple of tangents that may or may not be worth it.
No, all worth it. Great. I want to wrap, but I have another question. It's related to speed. I'm curious about the kinesiology behind why, like, okay, if I can play, if someone wants to play fast single strokes, digga, 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 right? So you're like, okay, well, one hand can go half that speed, da 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 da. The other hand can go that speed, da 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 da. Why can't I just put them together, digga, 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 digga? So what's going on? Like what is the physiology as to why I can't sync them up? Do you know? Maybe you don't know. Because speaking of the value of speed, people ask me about speed sometimes, as I'm sure they do, all of us. But I often say I think it's more about synchronization. of your two hands, because you can probably play each hand faster than that actually, but yet you can't do them together. So I almost think speed is much more of a coordination kind of thing than what we think of as traditional speed.
Yeah, and I don't mean to jump in there. I'm going to pull out my monocle and my brandy snifter here, because I'm going to say it's not synchronization, it's actually coordination.
What's that brandy? Is that brandy you've got there?
Yeah, that's my brandy. Yeah,
gotcha.
And I don't drink brandy at all, but that's kind of the proverbial thing, right? So yeah, the coordination of multiple motor patterns, and what you're basically talking about is doing two cyclical motor patterns that are slightly offset but highly coordinated in terms of when those events need to happen. And so you're really talking about coordinating multiple motor patterns. And that's a tricky thing. Like, that is a more complicated thing. So you're right, you can probably like single stroke at a certain tempo, but that doesn't mean that you can immediately put it into a double. And the brass player analogy is single tonguing and double tonguing. Like, I can go da 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 da, but if I want to go da 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 da, it's a lot harder to do because there's a coordinative aspect to it. And a lot of times we talk about strength, and like, are we we think we have to get stronger and we got to develop our even the word chops refers to like muscular development, right? Like, just to be stronger to do something. But the truth is, a lot of times we currently possess all the strength that we need, like in our bodies. And if you're a percussionist and you have picked up luggage or shoveled the driveway or washed dishes or like the things that you do in regular life in terms of your arm usage, it's probably an indicator that your arms are strong enough to do whatever you need to do on percussion instruments. It's more about coordinating and kind of like nuancedly, in a nuanced way, refining and the coordination of those movements. And so I think the example of like the two-handed roll versus the single-handed roll, it's perfect because it is more about coordination. And in order to do one event and then to line up the other event with when, based off of when that first event happens, that's tricky. It's just tricky, and I think I actually think it's trickier to do it slowly. If you start slowly and you go da ga da ga da ga da ga, you kind of give yourself a false sense of the amount of time you have to think about where that upbeat or where that other is going to go. And at some point, you need to figure out a way to not have to think so hard about that. It just becomes more of a rhythmic, like a global rhythmic idea, right? And so you almost have to prune away any conscious processing centers in the brain that are fixated on when to place that upbeat or when to place that other arm. And to prune that out of the mix, like that's kind of cumbersome. And I would argue that's just a less efficient way to do it.
So all right, I'm gonna ask this next question in a in this fashion because I need to wrap. How would you give your job interview answer to? Do you have a go-to solution for students that are just having struggles with motivation related to practice? Because it's related, I know it's kind of a tangent, but I think it's so related to practice. And like I was saying so long ago in the episode, I feel like a more mysterious problem is not like, hey, what you do in the practice room, but just like, hey, you need to get in the freaking practice room.
Right. How do you get the kids in the room? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think, to some extent, if we're talking about like being a teacher at like the college level, for example, and we're talking about developing a studio, then I think we're also talking about developing a culture for that studio. And if there is a culture of excellence and if there is a culture of motivation. And so if I'm in a job interview, then my answer would be geared toward talking to other faculty about how I would develop that culture.
Cool.
And one of the things I would say is that it's probably not with the seniors, to be honest. They are the most entrenched in whatever the culture was before I got there. It's probably going to be more in the freshmen and sophomores, the underclassmen, who I think will probably be a little bit more open-minded to new ideas, a little more malleable. And so it would be about developing a culture of excellence and motivation and getting them in the practice room. And so one of the things that I would do is probably develop some kind of freshman ensemble where it's just the freshmen playing in one ensemble and we all work together and we all, have that opportunity where we're not, on the one hand, they can get motivated and inspired by what they see like juniors and seniors doing. But on the other hand, that can also be a detractor. Like that can bring people down to a certain level of mediocrity. And I think every teacher has to, I'm sorry, you asked for the job interview answer, so I got to be a little more.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
So I would say that I would probably start with some kind of freshman chamber ensemble, and I would look for unique and interesting repertoire that meets them at their level. And I would approach that class as the kind of flagship class for changing the culture for 2, 3, 4 years down the line.
Right.
If I can get them all to buy into, valuing the practice logs, even comparing with each other a little bit, how great would it be if I had a bar graph in studio class that showed kind of where everybody's at in their practicing, not naming names, but just kind of showed like what the average studio practice time is, or, oh, these people that made this ensemble, their average practice time was this. If there were ways where I could quantify the results, almost like a game, almost like the gaming industry, where you're just trying to get kids to level up. And in every game, to level up, that level is going to be harder to achieve. And so you have to buy in a little bit more. And so it's all about figuring out where they're at and what is that next level that's not a huge stretch for them to buy into. Getting them to buy into that, and then getting them to buy into the next level and the next level and the next level. And if I can do that with my freshmen, and then when they become sophomores, then maybe now I have an undergraduate or like a lower division underclassmen ensemble, something like that. And then in my third year, I would have maybe a senior ensemble, but then I would also have like a freshman, sophomore, junior, type of ensemble. And then in my fourth year, I might have like, a percussion ensemble, like, everybody's, kind of in the pool. And I would probably work at it that way.
Very cool. It's, coincidentally, when they hired me here, our trombone professor was on my committee and asked me this exact question, like, what would you recommend for a struggling student? And I talked about culture, like this, like long-term plan, and just kind of getting it in the blood and just like infecting everyone with the good bug. Bill Collins says you got to get the practice bug. Do you have a quick answer for like, okay, what about that poor senior that in one semester they've been in this, let's say they've been in a non-existent practice culture their whole time here, and what can you do to salvage them for help them as best you can in one semester for motivation?
Well, I definitely have experience with this one. And what I have done is it's essentially a very similar approach. Hey, here are these practice logs. I find that this is a really helpful way to do it. And sometimes they're resistant to that. But it doesn't take that many. I mean, how many lessons in a row does a student need to come in, play like crap, and have us but basically say, all right, how was that? And they know. I've yet to find a student that's like nailed it when they totally did not nail it, right? They know. So then rather than putting an ego-based judgment on that, it's more about, okay, well, how did we get here? What did you do? Like, what got you this far? And everything's about like everything you did got you to where you are, and everything you didn't do is what, is keeping you from getting to the next place, right? So you can celebrate what people do, and then you can just inform them and try to enlighten them as to all that other stuff that needs to be done. And it's all about just, figuring out where they're at and just trying to get them to be a little bit, further along. I'm at a position now where I actually have like freshmen and sophomores that are outplaying my juniors and seniors. And frankly, I don't take joy in anybody feeling bad about that, because it's not about making people feel bad, but that is the nature of what's going to happen if the culture rises and the level of investment rises. That is a natural byproduct. So, and I find that when that happens, nothing motivates a senior from getting beat out of that whatever position they wanted in whatever ensemble. When they get beat out by a sophomore, that's some strong motivation. And so when that day comes, and I fully expect it to happen at a new job, when that day comes, I have a very frank talk with that student. Because if a student comes in and they're upset in their lesson that they didn't get what they wanted, I can say, well, you can keep doing what you're doing, in which case you will keep getting what you're getting, or you can up your game. And if you want to up your game, I got a lot of ways to do that. And then they're, at that point, they seem to be a little bit more open-minded toward, okay, so now you're going to fill out the practice log this week, right? Because this is totally going to help us. We need to figure out what you're spending your time on, or if you're not. And the truth is, most of the time that a student is resistant to filling out a practice log, it's because they don't really practice that much. It's far less common that it's a student who practices all the time. They're just not into filling out forms. Like, that's usually not what we find. we usually find it's the kids that just don't do a lot, and if they're not doing a lot in the practice room, they don't want to fill out the practice log. Okay, fine. And my response to that is always, well, it shouldn't take you that long to fill it out then.
Yeah.
If you're only doing 1 unit of 15 minutes a day, it shouldn't take you that long. So what's the problem? And then that also kind of removes the whole, as I think they're also concerned that I'm going to judge them when the practice log comes back with 1 unit a day. And so they don't want to do it, right? So I kind of immediately remove that from the equation without even having to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And so that's also helpful. And so with some of my seniors who have started to kind of drink the punch a little bit in their last semester, and if they have a recital coming up, 1 unit on this piece, 1 unit on this piece, 1 unit on this piece. If that's all you got, here we go. We're going to get it as good as we can with the time we have. And I remove the whole making people feel bad about what they're doing or not doing or whatever. If they want to feel that way, that's on them. I don't want to put them on, I don't want to put that on them. So I find that that's been a really healthy way to kind of go about it. And I've had some students that have kind of, drunk the punch in that senior year, and I've had some students that have not. And the ones that have not, they either pass or they don't pass, and they move on, and they're really, I didn't have much time to work with them. And so it is what it is. I try to change what I try to help as many as I can, and I try to, every time I run into a challenge with a student, I always ask myself, what could I be doing? Is there anything else I could do? Is there another way I could approach this? Is there another way I could say it? Can I get creative with how I do it with the student? But at the end of the day, it's on them. And I think that their successes are on them as well. When they are successful, I hate having to humble brag my way through CVs, with saying, I've got students that did this and I've got students that did that, because it's not me. They are the ones that went out and did that. And so I try to put that back on them, because it's there. They should get the credit for that, and in my own social media or whatever, I congratulate those students for doing it. It's not on me. So, that's just a brief little aside, I guess.
Wow. Very cool.
And by the way, I'm sorry, I don't seem to have short answers for anything. So the next time you ask if I have a short answer, I should just start with no, and I'm sorry.
No, that's really, really great. Man, thanks so much, Jason, Sulliman, and Brian, thanks so much for bringing him to us. Great pick. MVP. Brian, you're the MVP of the episode.
Had to unmute for that thumbs up.
In a row.
Yeah, just so you all know, Brian just unmuted and gave us a silent thumbs up.
It was a beautiful thumbs up, Brian. This has been fun. I hope I didn't data dump too much, but
it's great.
I am very passionate about sharing. I've had a lot of time to think about things. And so I'm very passionate about trying to share, my, take on things, and people can take it and, do stuff with it or not. And that's fine. But I love the fact that you have this podcast. Or are you calling it a podcast?
Yeah.
Okay. I love that you have this podcast and that you are getting together and you're having these conversations and that you're sharing with people. I think that's just so important for our industry, in our community. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you. And it's so important what you're doing, because as the world gets more competitive and we get more people out there competing, we're going to have to find more ways to get clever. It's hey, whoever practiced more and longer in the practice room always gets the gig. That's going to start to apply less and less, because once everyone's done 12 hours a day, well, it's going to come down to who used the 12 hours better. So it's cool that you have this research and that you're connecting kinesiology and your musicianship together like this. It's really great.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
Hey, everybody. Thank you. We'll catch you on 263. Karli, why don't you tell everyone to join the Patreon? Just tell them to do it.
Yeah, everybody, join our Patreon, please.
Yeah,
Show us that you appreciate what we're doing.
Good. All right. Bye, everybody. See you later.